Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be discussing the 100th anniversary of the start of the British civil administration over Palestine and the battle to implement not only the Balfour Declaration, but also the San Remo resolution. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have two very distinguished guests with me, joining me today, and that is the filmmaker Hugh Kitson and also the legendary Colonel Richard Kemp, who was the commander of the British forces in Afghanistan, served in Cobra, and is a strong defender of Israel and the Jewish people, and I could go on, couldn't I?
Please do.
Hugh, welcome back to the programme. Please share with us how difficult dealing with COVID-19 has been, and also how this year has been very, very significant for your latest documentary, which is called Whose Land, where in April we remembered the 100th anniversary of the San Remo resolution that gave the international legal framework the implementation of the Balfour Declaration in helping to re-establish the modern state of Israel. How have you dealt with COVID-19, and how has your documentary done in terms of waking people up to the truth about Israel's legal foundations?
Well, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, I stayed at home pretty well, but actually, even from home, it's been one of the busiest periods. A whole lot of events had to be either cancelled or postponed indefinitely. There was to be a series of San Remo celebrations here in London in April, and those have been postponed till late October, provided, of course, that we're able to meet then. And then there were also two events in San Remo itself, which have also been postponed. But there has also been a plus side, because the whole 100th anniversary of the San Remo resolution is now going to be spread over a whole 12 months. And certainly there have been television broadcasts that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And so the message of San Remo has been able to get out there to a greater extent than it would have otherwise done. And the same with Whose Land. We've done a number of webinars. I'd never even heard of the word webinar before this. And we've sort of become zombies, in a sense, that Richard and I have done two, and there's another one yet to come, webinars with various different organisations. So we've been able to get this whole message of San Remo, which is so vital because it is actually the legal foundation of the modern state of Israel in international law. And it was agreed to by the entire international community at that time, all 51 founding nations in the League of Nations. So the COVID-19 has actually helped that in one sense.
That's good news. And Rich, it's always a pleasure to have you on the programme, and you are the star of Whose Land, so it's great that you're on with Hugh. But there's a story you've got to tell us, and that's the story about your tie, because I asked you, because we recorded a programme earlier, and I said to you, bring two ties, and you said, no, I only have one tie. So tell us the story about the actual tie that you're wearing, because it's your regiment.
Well, before I answer that, it's a real pleasure to be on the show with you again, and you're a great interviewer. And you saw him as a star of Whose Land. I wouldn't classify myself as the star of Whose Land. I'd classify Hugh Kitson as the star of Whose Land, because although he wasn't on screen, he was the writer, director, producer of the whole thing and did an absolutely fantastic job. I was able to use his words to convey the message. But in relation to the tie, most of your viewers will be well aware this is the tie of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Anglian Regiment, which is the battalion I had the honour to command towards the end of my service in the army. And it originates with the Royal Norfolk Regiment. And it's, you know, it's quite a striking colour tie, and it's, people have compared the colouring on this tie to the colouring on a coral snake, which is, as you know, one of the most deadly snakes in the world. And I think that also goes for the Royal Anglian Regiment. It's one of the most deadly infantry regiments in the most deadly army in the world.
I have to ask you a very important question which is related to this. I mean, you are no stranger to the theatre of battle. I mean, you've served with distinction in the Bosnian conflict, during the crisis in the Balkans, you fought in the Challenger tank during the Gulf War in 1991, and you've also served in Afghanistan as the head of British forces. But why have you taken up this battle to defend Israel and the Jewish people, and particularly defending those brave and courageous men and women of the IDF, the Israeli Defence Force?
Well, there's a simple answer to that, and the simple answer is that we're fighting the same war. We're on the same side. We have the same values. Britain, the United States of America, Israel, the other English-speaking countries, and most European countries, we share the same value. We're part of the same culture, in effect. And when you see the greatest slur campaign that the world's ever known directed against the state of Israel, if you're on their side, you've got no choice other than to give them your support, and that's what I do. And I know how much we as a country benefit from them, never mind economically, but I'm talking from personal point of view, I'm talking about the intelligence benefit we get from Israel. I've personally experienced the way in which Israel provides intelligence to us, which saves our soldiers' lives and our civilians' lives. Israeli battlefield medical technology, which has saved many soldiers, and Israeli combat technology, which has made our forces more effective against the enemy and also helped save their lives. So there's so many different things to this, but I think what anyone who's like me, who was a military commander, can go and talk to Israeli soldiers. I was recently down on the Gaza border when they were being attacked by Hamas across the border, who wanted to break through the border. And I was watching and talking to these young men and women down there fighting for their country. And I knew that when they came back, when they finished that deployment, they were watching on Sky Television or the BBC or one of these other programs, CNN, watching accounts of them as war criminals and have, you know, baby killers, as my own regiment's been accused of as well, by the way. And if you see that, you've got no choice other than to stand up for them, because you know they're not their heroes. They are heroically putting their lives on the line to defend their country and, incidentally, to defend our country as well.
Absolutely. And before we start talking about the 100th anniversary of the start of the civil administration over the mandate of Palestine by the British government, which occurred 100 years ago this month, I have to ask you, Hugh, what was it that inspired you to make the film Whose Land, and why did you do it?
Well, the vision for the project actually goes back nearly 30 years, the early 1990s. And I realized that Israel's enemies were actually trying to rewrite history. And the verifiable history of the re-establishment of the nation of Israel in their homeland needed to be told from verifiable history. Then about 10 years ago, at the time of the 90th anniversary of the San Remo conference, I became aware of the legal issues surrounding the establishment of the State of Israel from a legal perspective. And that is a story that really does need to be told, because we have what is called lawfare today, where international law, or rather a distortion of international law, is being used against Israel to try and delegitimize her. So That was really what has prompted Whose Land.
Excellent. So let's have a look at a trailer for Whose Land.
For several decades now, politicians, clerics and school teachers living in the areas known as the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and East Jerusalem have been teaching their children, teenagers and young adults that the whole of the land of Israel in fact belongs to the Arab people who are today known as the Palestinians.
نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يمليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا بأن القدس عربية وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل اللعين.
So the name Palestine after 1948 was kind of adopted by the non-Jewish Palestinians, and they say we are the true Palestinians. We belong in the land. We are the indigenous people. And these Jews came in later and created this colonial thing called Israel.
So what historic and legal claim do the Palestinian Arabs have over Jerusalem and the land of Israel? Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law with a highly qualified group of historians and international lawyers.
San Remo, the Villa de Vacha. This is a place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people.
San Remo basically adopted the content of the Balfour Declaration, and it was approved by 51 countries, which was then the international community.
The San Remo Resolution of 1920, its unanimous endorsement by the League of Nations, is binding under international law to this day.
It's in this place that the leaders with the power to make binding dispositions deliberated and made the decision as to who would get what.
Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And Whose Land is a must-watch for anyone who wants to know the historical and the legal rights to Israel as a nation. So definitely worth watching. You starred in that excellent documentary produced by a good friend here, Hugh. What was it like to be a part of that documentary to communicate the truth of Israel's legality as a nation? Because there is so many nations that have been given sovereignty since the end of the Second World War. I think one of the newest is the nation Southern Sudan. And yet none of these nations have their sovereignty or their right to exist as a nation. So why is it that only Israel is singled out amongst the nations and her very legitimacy as a nation state is questioned when Israel's heritage to that land goes back thousands and thousands of years?
Well, it was for me a great pleasure to be asked by Hugh to present the documentary, because not only I think is it a message that people need to hear, but it's also something that's extremely important to me personally, and it goes back before the founding of countries after the Second World War. Israel, the decision taken effectively at San Remo, and before that effectively by the Balfour Declaration in 1917, that whole decision-making process also led to the creation of other countries in the Middle East, like Iraq, like Lebanon, like Jordan. And where are the people questioning their right to exist? You know, the mandate given to the British and the French to create these countries included all of those countries and included Israel, but nobody questions those other countries. It's not particularly puzzling when you understand that never from the very beginning have the Arabs in the Middle East accepted that that there should be a Jewish-controlled state. They've had Jews living in their states for centuries, ever since they took over the Middle East, but they don't want Jews controlling any state. Now, that is the position held today, still held today, by the Palestinian leadership in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. It is not any longer the position held by most of the Arab governments in the Middle East, who have now come to realize that Israel, actually the Jewish state, is on the same side as they are against a common threat from Iran. And so at least on a tactical basis, Israel has today, not openly and not publicly very much, but under the radar, has huge amount of support from Arabs in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And Hugh, as we mark the 100th anniversary of the start of the British civil administration of the Mandate of Palestine, knowing that we're 2 years away from the actual 100th anniversary of the implementation of the British Mandate as told by the League of Nations. So can you just give us a brief historical overview of how we got here, really, from the rise of political Zionism with Theodore Herzl to the First World War, and how the Holy Land came into the hands of the British?
Well, originally, Herzl was wanting the Germans to actually sponsor a Zionist, or the formation of a Zionist state, and that didn't happen. And in Britain, there had been a couple of hundred years of a Zionist vision among Christians who they understood from the Bible that in order for the Lord Jesus to return, Israel had to be restored to her land. And so you had that Christian Zionism in Britain in the lead up to the Balfour Declaration. And in many respects, the Balfour Declaration could be said to be an answer to the prayers of those Christians. And so the Balfour Declaration happened in November 19... Actually, the War Cabinet decided on the final wording of that on the 31st of October in 1917. And simultaneously with that meeting in Whitehall, the Australian Light Horse actually charged into Beersheba and captured Beersheba, which was the beginning of the British conquest of the former Ottoman territories. And without that victory, the Balfour Declaration could never have been implemented. In December 1917, General Allenby took Jerusalem, and so you had a military government formed in Jerusalem in December of 1917, and you could say it was a military occupation. It was, which is a legal thing, and unfortunately, the British military, by and large, did not accept the idea or concept of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So you had a military, especially when General Bowles became the first military governor, that were actually against the idea of a Jewish national home. So there was, if you like, a conflict between the military and Whitehall. And I'd just like to show a short clip from The Forsaken Promise, which we made about 15 years ago, which tells the story. And my historian friend, Kelvin Crombie, begins it. So here it is.
The British had control over lots of Muslim people at that stage. The British administration that was here in place by then wasn't sympathetic at all. the most, if not all, I'd say most, of the administrators that came and filled the various positions in what was known as occupied enemy South originally, a lot of those guys had earned their stripes, you might say, in Arab areas as administrators. So they came up and they began to fill these positions. So just imagine the Zionist organisation coming in and saying, well, we've been given this promise by the government that this will be a Jewish homeland. And they're sort of thinking, never heard that. Or if they had heard it, they didn't want to acknowledge it.
They didn't see it as their obligation to proclaim or publicise British government policy as expressed in the Balfour Declaration, and that was intentional. The British decided, or the British military government decided that was a political issue for which they weren't prepared to get involved.
In June 1919, General Bowles was appointed military governor of Jerusalem, and when Colonel Patterson, who was friendly towards Zionism, heard that Bowles had been appointed, he was absolutely shocked, and he wrote the following. He said, "I know Bowles well. I worked with him for 2 years. I knew him as an out-and-out anti-Semite who would leave no stone unturned to destroy the Jewish national home, root and branch." Well, of course, with this kind of attitude at the top, the outlook filtered down to the subordinates, and very, very soon this became the norm. And from that time on, there wasn't either a military governor or later on, apart from Sir Herbert Samuel, there wasn't even a civil governor who wasn't tainted with anti-Semitism.
In 1919, Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen had been appointed by the government in Whitehall as the chief political officer in Palestine. His job was to ensure that government policy was implemented by the military administration. In his diary, which was published many years later, Meinertzhagen recorded an attempt by Colonel Waters Taylor, the governor's chief of staff, to use a well-known Arab agitator to sabotage the outcome of the San Remo conference.
Colonel Waters Taylor and his wife were very strong pro-Arab and supported Hajj Amin in instigating the riot in 1920 in Easter.
Colonel Walters Taylor met with El-Husseini, Hajj al-Amin, and he told him, and this is a quote, that he had a great opportunity to show the world that Zionism was unpopular, not only with the Palestine administration, but also in Whitehall. That wasn't true, actually. And he said that if disturbances of sufficient violence took place over Easter, then both General Bowles and General Allenby would advocate the abandonment of the Jewish national home.
According to Meinertzhagen, Colonel Waters Taylor went on to tell him that freedom could only be attained through violence. Hajj Amin took the colonel's advice and instigated a riot. Agitators addressed the Muslim crowds, urging them forward against the Jews, who had been disarmed on the orders of the administration. All Jewish policemen had been relieved from duty in the Jewish quarter of the old city. The riot started with cries of, "We shall drink the blood of the Jews. Don't be afraid, the government is with us." The mob rushed in, brandishing knives and clubs. The government surrounded the old city with a cordon of police and troops to prevent outside help. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who had fought with distinction in the British Army during World War I, managed to break through the police cordon to quell the bloodshed.
Jabotinsky and his self-defense boys were locked up in jail. Jabotinsky was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. And the only reason why he didn't serve that term was because there was an uproar which was absolutely unprecedented.
Hajj Amin was given a 5-year sentence for his overt role in the pogrom, but he escaped in mysterious circumstances. A pattern had been set that would haunt the rest of British rule over Palestine. Meanwhile, Colonel Meinertzhagen, the chief political officer, had reported back to the Foreign Office the complicity of the military administration in causing the violence. As a result, the military administration was disbanded and replaced with a civil administration. Sir Herbert Samuel was appointed as the first High Commissioner of Palestine. The Jewish community was overjoyed by his appointment. The Arabs were less than happy, and so were some members of the British administration.
It's reported that one of the staff of the British civil administration said, and there I was at Government House, and a huge Union Jack flying, and underneath it sat a bloody Jew.
The San Remo Conference of April 1920 had awarded Britain the mandate to govern Palestine. This gave the Balfour Declaration official status.
And those were the extraordinary events that occurred in Israel over 100 years ago. As a military historian, Richard, what's your assessment of the British forces and the Anzac forces that defeated the Ottomans during the First World War to actually liberate the Holy Land and actually push back the Ottoman Empire into what is now modern Turkey?
Well, it was an extremely significant battle. I mean, it was a campaign which it had been running for a few years in total, but actually in 1917 and 1918 it was almost a lightning campaign compared to anything else that had been going on in the First World War. And it involved large numbers of British troops, aircraft, armoured vehicles, horses, artillery, the full range. And the troops were mainly British, but also quite a few Australians, New Zealanders, and some other nationalities involved there as well. And if they hadn't achieved what they achieved in that campaign and defeated the Ottomans there, I think it would be right to say that we would have no reason to believe that the state of Israel would exist today, because Balfour Declaration is only on paper. It doesn't actually make reality on its own. Likewise, the San Remo mandate wouldn't have been possible had that war not have been won by the British Empire. And so I think it was of fundamental importance to the situation that exists in the Middle East today and the recreation of the Jewish state. And one other thing I would say is that as well as British troops and Anzacs fighting there in Palestine, there was an element of the British Army called the Jewish Legion, which was the first formed Jewish fighting force since the Maccabees, part of the British Army. It included a certain Private David Green, who later became David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. He was a soldier in the British Army in that campaign. Amazing. And numerous other big names. So they played a very important role. And the other organisation I'll mention is NILI, which was an intelligence, a spy organisation, which were basically the Jewish spies in Palestine who put the organisation together themselves. A chap called Aronson and his sister, Aaron Aronson and Sarah Aronson. They put this organisation together themselves to provide intelligence on the Turks to the British. And they, by numerous different ways over the period of that campaign, they kept the British informed about what the Turks were doing. And Allenby's chief of intelligence after the First World War said that had it not been for NILI, then the British forces in Palestine would not have succeeded with as few casualties as they sustained, and there were a lot nevertheless, and as quickly as they did it. So I think, these were the early fighters for the Jewish state, and of course many who'd been in the Jewish Legion and other Jews who'd fought in the Allied forces in the First World War and the Second went in to make up the IDF.
Amazing, incredible. And Hugh, can you tell us, I've done several programmes about the 100th anniversary of the San Remo Conference, how important the San Remo Conference was and how important it is today in terms of Israel's international legitimacy as a modern state under international law, because this is very important to this discussion that we're having today.
Well, it's actually vital. What's interesting about the mandate itself is that the wording of the mandate, and we'll be coming to another clip on this later, it talks about the right of the Jewish people to reconstitute their national home. Now, you've got to remember that the mandate was agreed unanimously, there wasn't any dissent at all, by the League of Nations, all 51 members of the League of Nations. And I'm not sure that America was part of the League of Nations at that time, but the Americans separately, through their Congress, passed a law endorsing the mandate. So they also recognized the right of the Jewish people to reconstitute their national home. The other thing I should say about this, the word national home is used in all of the documentation, but actually if you go back to the War Cabinet meeting on the 31st of October 1917, Lord Balfour himself actually, and it's in the minutes of that meeting, actually talks about, in time, the formation of a Jewish state. They weren't expecting it to happen overnight, but in time there would be a Jewish state. So that is a vital part of the whole concept of a Jewish national home, was ultimately there would be a Jewish state.
And Richard, discuss with us the historic role given by the British 100 years ago to pave the way for the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel that occurred on the 14th of May 1948.
I mean, Britain plays a fundamental part here. Britain was given that mandate by the League of Nations, and that mandate effectively became international law. This was not it's not a matter for debate and discussion, it is a matter of international law. And it was subsequently enshrined into the Charter of the United Nations and remains today international law. And those people who argue that Israel does not have an entitlement to that territory, to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria and Gaza, as well as what is now considered to be Israel proper, don't understand international law. They have no legitimacy, those people who call that illegal occupation and illegal settlements. They have no legitimacy because the law says otherwise. The law says this belongs to Israel. Now, it is disputed, of course, like many territories around the world are disputed, but the fact is that it belongs to the state of Israel. It's part of the state of Israel. And I think I find it deeply troubling and deeply concerning at this time when Israel is considering extending its sovereignty into some of these areas, not the whole area, but some of these areas, mainly where there is an overwhelmingly large Jewish population, not Arab population, that our Prime Minister, as well as other world leaders, are telling the Prime Minister of Israel that he can't do it, that he shouldn't do it, that it's illegitimate. They and their advisors are very clearly wrong about that, and it is immoral, in my opinion, to attempt to prevent Israel from exercising its rights over its own sovereign territory.
Absolutely. And Hugh, why is it so important today that we are discussing the 100th anniversary of the start of the civil administration that became the British Mandate of Palestine?
Well, in some ways, as Richard's just said, I mean, the British government has turned around completely, and in fact, that process started not long after the San Remo conference. For instance, in 1929, Arabs attacked a number of places where there were Jewish communities, Hebron being one of them, and there was a massacre. And very sadly, the British administration, instead of doing the just thing and bringing those who attacked the Jewish community to justice actually started to appease the Arab demands. And basically the Arab demand, certainly under Haj Amin al-Husseini, who you saw in that last clip, he'd been made the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and Sir Herbert Samuel actually appointed him into that position because he thought if he had some responsibility, it would sort of somehow mellow him. Well, it actually had the opposite effect. And so we began to see a departure from the British position, and it was really very sad to see. It was a violation of the mandate, basically.
Richard, can you give us a little bit of an insight into why the British military establishment in Palestine, who were administrating, in charge of the Holy Land, wanted to oppose the concept of the Jewish national homeland, in which they were severely criticised by the Zionists, who thought the British would soon allow us to have our own nation again after 2,000 years?
Well, the first thing I'd say about that is, as a military man myself, served 30 years as a soldier, it certainly is not the place of any army to decide whether it likes or dislikes national policy. Its job is to support national policy, and the national policy at that time was the Balfour Declaration. Therefore, the establishment of, or the re-establishment of Jewish national homeland in Palestine. The same kind of delusions persist in not so much in the Ministry of Defence today, in the forces, but mainly in the Foreign Office. The same kind of hangover from our colonial days, where we think we can call the shots and make the decisions in countries like, in places like the Middle East. The Foreign Office still cling to this idea, and that's why you see so many Foreign Office mandarins who certainly seem to be on the side of the Arabs and against the Israelis, and it seems to have, be seriously affecting national policy. And it goes back all the way to during the First World War and after the First World War and through in the Second World War and so on, when there was a huge dependence, particularly later years, on oil from the Middle East, and a need to appease the Arabs and keep the Arabs happy, as opposed to the Jews, who had no oil. So I think that played a big role and still plays a big role today. But one problem that the Foreign Office has in this situation is that it's failed to keep up with events. And the Arab countries in the Middle East these days are not opposed to the existence of Israel. They support it. They understand the strength of Israel and the value of Israel. They don't want to see the destruction of Israel. But the Foreign Office hasn't realised that yet. And so they're still treating Israel as though it was deemed by Arab countries as being an enemy. I think the Foreign Office is going to struggle to overcome it. We used to refer to them as the Camel Corps because of their extreme pro-Arab bias against the Israelis.
Interesting. And Hugh, when we're talking about the British military controlled administration over the Holy Land 100 years ago, why would they promote someone like al-Husseini, who had strong links to the Muslim Brotherhood, would instigate riots against the Jewish people? They would have known what character he was. He wasn't part of the established Arab community of that land. He was an outsider and someone who wanted to instigate violence, because only a couple of years earlier, you had Chaim Weizmann actually meet with the sorry, I've forgotten his name.
Emir Faisal.
Emir Faisal, exactly. And Faisal recognised that if the Jewish people had their own state, then maybe the Zionists can also help the Arabs get their own state. So this has to be probably the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict, doesn't it? The appointment of al-Husseini to the position of Grand Mufti.
Yes. As I said earlier, it was Sir Herbert Samuel, I believe, who was responsible for that. And he did think that appointing him into that position would calm him down. But there's another side to it as well. Sir Herbert Samuel was Jewish. he was a Zionist. In fact, even as far back as 1915, he had suggested to the government under Prime Minister Asquith and Foreign Secretary Gray that there should be an independent Jewish state in the Holy Land. And because he was Zionist, he was also wanting to appear to be sympathetic with the Arabs as such. And so he tried as far as he could to steer a middle ground between them. Now, I think it was a very bad decision, and I think history shows that, because al-Husseini did more to torpedo the mandate than anyone else.
And Richard, share with us how enterprising the Jewish community living under the British administration were by by establishing a Jewish state, or building the infrastructures of the Jewish state, I should say, such as the Jewish Agency and civil Jewish organisations, plus also the incredible influence that Ord Wingate played, who was a British officer in creating the Haganah that became the IDF. Share with us his role, and without his help, maybe we wouldn't have the IDF as it is today.
Yeah, I mean, on Wingate, first of all, his name is well known throughout Israel. There are streets named after him. There's the Army's Physical Training Centre is named after Ord Wingate. And most people know the name, and he was referred to as the friend by Jews in Israel. He was out there in the 1930s, a Christian British Army officer working in intelligence. And he took it upon himself. Mainly, I believe, obviously he was a man who knew justice and wanted to see justice imposed, but he was also driven by his own Christian faith and his deep knowledge and understanding of the Bible. And he took it upon himself to defend the Jewish communities that were coming under attack from the Arabs in the 1930s, to teach them how to fight back, to teach them you don't just wait for the enemy to come to you and destroy your village, you go out and get them first. And he helped form night fighting squads among the Jewish villagers, and even persuaded the British hierarchy, which was opposed to the idea, to undertake joint operations with Jewish civilian militia groups. So he was a man of great, great importance. He then went on and fought in the Second World War, became a general, was killed in Burma, fighting the Japanese. And David Ben-Gurion said after the war, he said that had Wingate survived the Second World War, he would have become the first Chief of Staff of the IDF, which is an incredible thing to think a British Christian officer would have been the Chief of Staff of the IDF. I think one other thing I just want to mention, apart from all the various infrastructure that was created to support and develop and maintain the Jewish state, one thing that's extremely important is the clearing of the land of mosquitoes, malaria, which was a scourge. And that territory was, in the whole of the world, was most effectively cleared of malaria and made malaria-free. And it was the first, I think, major malarial country to become free of malaria, and that was down to a Jewish scientist who was out there, and Zionist, who organised an anti-malaria program and managed to persuade. This had actually been started under Allenby when he was fighting against the Ottomans. They'd had to deal with malaria then, because of course that was probably a worse enemy than the Ottomans. But he maintained it after the war, this Jewish scientist. And he managed to persuade the Arabs and the Jews to work together on destroying malaria. And Amin al-Husseini, the infamous man whose name keeps coming up, he tried his best to stop the Arabs from cooperating against malaria. So he launched violent attacks against Arabs who were helping to deal with malaria, which was, of course, saving the lives of Arabs just as much as it was anyone else. Absolutely. But ultimately, they succeeded. And that was, if they hadn't succeeded in that, I think it would have been very hard to see the land being settled on anything like the scale that it eventually was by either Arabs or Jews.
Also involved the planting of eucalyptus trees, which drained the swamps, which got rid of the malaria and got rid of the mosquitoes. Incredible.
That was all part of it, yeah.
Very, very clever.
Yeah.
Hugh, do you want to introduce our next video? And this is an extract from Whose Land?
Yes, it's looking at the legal obligations of the mandate, because this is really very crucial. And sadly, in the end, Britain violated these obligations on almost every single level. But I think it's a good thing to just remind ourselves of what Britain was actually obligated to do in the mandate.
During July 1922, the British Parliament debated and finally approved what was known as the Churchill White Paper. And then the draft of the mandate for Palestine was confirmed by the Council of the League of Nations and was approved on July 24th. The preamble to the mandate document incorporated the wording of the Balfour Declaration. Another foundational clause in the preamble states, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country.
The mandate is based upon the Balfour Declaration, and that declaration has been incorporated by reference at least in 3 places. It's been incorporated specifically in the San Remo resolutions, which established that Britain was to take the mandate. It has been referred to in the Treaty of Sèvres between the Allied powers and Turkey as to the disposition of the Ottoman territories, and it was specifically referred to and incorporated by reference into the Palestine Mandate.
In formulating legally binding instruments, there was a recognition of the cultural, historic roots of the Jewish people in that land. That it was more than just a legal decision, it was based in the cultural heritage of the Jewish people.
They are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the great powers at the time, by the equivalent of the UN at the time.
Which means that if they can establish that they had a vibrant community in Jerusalem, or in Hebron, or in Shiloh, and in different areas of the Holy Land, they've been given the right to reconstitute these communities. The key to Article 2 is the decree, the enactment of the policy of the Balfour Declaration. It becomes part of international law.
Article 2 of the mandate states, the mandatory, that is Great Britain, shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative and economic conditions as will secure the Jewish national home.
The Mandate of Palestine was quite specific about who was the beneficiary of this right of self-determination. The preamble to the mandate tells us that the mandate was created in order to reconstitute the Jewish homeland on its ancient land. If you read through the mandate, you'll see there are a number of provisions that were designed to guarantee that. The mandatory authorities, the British, were supposed to cooperate with the Jewish agency in running the mandate. They were supposed to encourage and facilitate the acquisition of citizenship by Jews, immigration by Jews, close settlement of Jews on the land. So there are all these provisions that show us that it was a mandate designed to guarantee the self-determination of the Jewish people.
The whole idea of the mandate was for the Jews to be given the right to immigrate so that the population could increase, so that while the trust is ongoing, they would be stronger, more numerous, and then could declare the independence of their country. That was the whole strategy.
It's worth noting here that the mandate does not name any other ethnic group or any other peoples than the Jewish people as far as obtaining through the mandate political authority over this territory. It does mention the non-Jewish communities and does preserve for them, by the language of the mandate, their civil and religious rights, but all the political rights were reserved to the Jewish people.
Move to 1930, restrictions start to be imposed. After so many years of conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, Britain starts to turn her back on the Jewish people, starts to diminish the rights that were already given in the mandate for Palestine, contrary to their obligations as mandatory.
And it's very important that when it comes to Israel that we have a historical, political, legal, as well as spiritual understanding of the importance and significance of Israel, and also the betrayal by the British government during the mandate years to prepare the Jewish people for their own homeland after 2,000 years. And this is why this documentary is so important. Hugh, we're coming down to the last few minutes, and I just want to sum up, but also want to add into the mix of how relevant the San Remo resolution is today, 100 years on, and 100 years on from the start of the civil administration over the Holy Land.
Well, I think we need to be reminded that it was actually Britain and the British Empire, but Britain itself that spearheaded the revival or the restoration of the Jewish national home. And we signed, we signed a treaty, a legally binding treaty, which, as you saw in that clip, we violated on every single level virtually. And this has had ramifications to this day, because the legal rights of Israel in perception have actually been turned on their head. And this is added fuel to the lawfare, which I mentioned earlier, that's going on today. And to the extent that even over this extension of sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, our government has gone back on what we legally signed up to 100 years ago.
Richard, do you want to share with us the letter that you wrote to our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who we know is very pro-Israel, but he did take the unprecedented step to have an op-ed piece published in an Israeli newspaper, Idiot Aharonot, warning the Israelis not to proceed with extending sovereignty and law over the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, I mean, I together with Hugh Kitson, wrote a letter to the foreign minister about this, following the foreign minister's letter, his own letter complaining about, or I beg your pardon, a letter by a group of MPs to the foreign minister complaining about Israel's extension of sovereignty.
30 seconds. Yeah.
And I wrote to the Prime Minister as well, basically explaining to him what I explained to your audience, that the opposition to Israel extending its sovereignty is not only illegal, it's also immoral.
Excellent. Hugh and Richard, I want to thank you so much for being my guests on today's Middle East Report, particularly as we remember the 100th anniversary of the start of the civil administration in Palestine, which did lead to the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel. So, excellent contribution, and I'm looking forward to the next part of the documentary Whose Land when it's coming out.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. It's so important that when we advocate for Israel, that we have a historical, we have a political, we have a legal, but also a spiritual understanding of God's plans and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. And because of the events that occurred in Israel over 100 years ago, gives Israel her international legitimacy as a modern state, because it wasn't just Britain that recognised a Jewish homeland in the ancient covenant homeland of the Jewish people. which is the land of Israel, but also the international community, the Allied powers who defeated the Ottomans and who defeated the Germans. So that's why it's important that we have this understanding, and this is why it's important that we also educate ourselves so that we can communicate the truth. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.